Good afternoon, and welcome to the 22nd Annual Gayle K. Lee Health Awareness Luncheon. I'm Bonnie Gould, and I'm privileged to be the chair of the Cancer Support Team. It's so wonderful to see everyone here today, and it's hard to believe that it's been 2 years since we had an in-person event. I want to thank all of you for coming. It's a beautiful day, and we have a wonderful program planned for you. And just a gentle reminder for safety of our patients as well as our guests, that if you get up and leave your table, that you wear your mask. So thank you very much.
Okay, I'm Tanya Weiss, and I'm the executive director of this absolutely amazing organization. I am so happy to be here today. So why are we here? You know, why do we hold a luncheon? Why do we have an education luncheon? Why do we have Cancer Support Team? Well, nearly 44 years ago, two very smart and very ahead of their time individuals, Dr. Arnold Wald and Gayle K. Lee, started Cancer Support Team. And they knew, because he was a radiation oncologist and she was a registered nurse and patient advocate, and they saw all the way back in the 1970s that cancer affected way more than just your physical body. They wanted to address all the different kinds of issues that come up: self-image, anxiety, family dynamics, friendships, and of course your pocketbook.
CST's mission has not changed since that time, 44 years ago, to enhance the lives of cancer patients and their families who live in southern Westchester. And enhance their lives we do.
So despite the COVID pandemic, last year, CST managed to help over 600 families, and we made nearly 3,800 visits. That's a lot of visits. Think about that. They occurred in person, yes, on porches, at the park, indoors when everyone felt comfortable, and also via telemedicine. We had FaceTime and Zoom, and of course the telephone. And this year, the pandemic isn't over, and we're on track to make nearly 5,000 visits. We see every day just how vital Cancer Support Team is to this community.
CST is a tireless team whom we want to thank for all of their hard work and their dedication, especially this past year during COVID. Could I ask at this time that all of our CST staff please stand? A big round of applause for all of them.
So some of them are at the back of the room and outdoors. I couldn't be prouder of this amazing team. Probably everyone in this room can understand how difficult a cancer diagnosis is. If you're not a survivor yourself, you likely have a close friend who is. Our guest speaker is a survivor and an author. Cynthia Hayes knows all about coping with cancer. Her book, The Big Ordeal, which some of you who are going to see Cynthia later at our private reception will all receive a book, but those who would like to purchase one, they are available and will be for sale at the end of the event. Her book describes what physically and chemically happens in a patient's body that causes intense emotional reactions. Okay, don't worry, she's not giving a biology lesson. Cynthia writes eloquently in her book and on her blog. She shares personal as well as patient and caregiver stories about coping and courage. Her most recent blog spoke about the hidden treasures she found while cleaning a closet after returning to New York City after a long absence due to COVID, and I quote, "Finding reserves in the closet is like remembering the hidden strengths we forget we have when going through an ordeal like cancer. No matter how even-keeled and perfect our lives appear to others, we have all had to cope with something unpleasant in the past and somehow figured out how to do it. Amid the high anxiety of a cancer diagnosis, it can be challenging to recall those strengths and put them to good use. But, like the treasures in the back of the closet, they're there, waiting to be called upon. Cynthia, I'm so glad you're here. She has great wisdom to share. Please join us.
Such a terrific introduction. Thank you all so much for being here today, and thank you to the Cancer Support Team for all that you do for cancer patients everywhere. Thank you all in the audience for all that you do to support the Cancer Support Team, because it is such an important resource for those of us who are going through cancer or recovering from cancer or helping somebody else get through cancer. And before I get started, just so I have a sense of the audience, how many of you are currently or have in the past had a cancer diagnosis? Okay, so that's about 40% of us, and that is actually somewhat typical of the United States in general. 40% of us will receive a cancer diagnosis at some point in our lives, and the other 60% of us will love someone who does. And that's why it's so important to understand about cancer, because coping with cancer is hard. And for most of us, as loving caregivers to a cancer patient, we want to jump in and we want to help in any way that we can, but we don't always know how to help. We don't always know what to say, and we don't always understand what's going through the mind of a cancer patient. And it's because we're unprepared for that diagnosis and hearing somebody else's diagnosis that we're not actually able to know what to say at the time we hear the news. And of course, no one expects a cancer diagnosis. Monty Python once said, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Well, a cancer diagnosis, like the Spanish Inquisition, is it's an unexpected event. So I'm hoping that what I say today can help you prepare just a little bit more for should you hear the words, or in fact, should a loved one hear the words, you've got cancer. I'm hoping that what I say can help you cope a little bit better and help you support a little bit better. Let me just start by telling you a little bit about myself and my own experience. Like most of us, I was thoroughly unequipped for my diagnosis, which came totally out of the blue. I had gone to see my gynecologist for a regular checkup. I received a phone call a week later saying that I had flunked my pap smear. Well, those of you who know me know I don't flunk anything, so this was really bad. But her words caught me off guard, not just because I had flunked such an important test, but it was like, how could I have flunked that? I am healthy, I have no symptoms, there's nothing going on physically that I should know about, so why is this happening to me? And of course, when I had a moment to look up the type of errant cells that she found on my cervix, the sign of a very aggressive cancer with very grim survival statistics, I instantly assumed that I was going to die. And that was the beginning of what turned out to be a physical and emotional roller coaster ride. It was another 10 days of trying to do more testing, trying to find a surgeon, actually getting that surgery done, and then another 10 days of waiting for the biopsy results to come back, and then 6 months of chemotherapy after a radical hysterectomy. It was a grueling time physically, and then eventually 5.5 years of living with Ned. Well, Ned is not the name of my husband. Ned stands for no evidence of disease, and those are the words we are happiest to hear. So it was a physically challenging time for me. But part of what makes cancer so difficult for patients and for those of us who love them is that it's an emotional experience as well as a physical one. And I don't think many of us understand that going into a cancer ordeal. I myself didn't. And it was when I was close to the end of treatment, and I was at the gym trying desperately to get physically fit again, bald, weak, feeling very much like a cancer patient, but sitting on a bicycle when a total stranger, a gentleman I had seen at the gym before but never had a conversation with, came and sat on the bike next to me. And as I pedaled oh so slowly, he started telling me his cancer story. And the more he talked about his experience, the more I heard about his sense of isolation, his fear, his depression, the lack of understanding and deep support from his family and friends. And I looked at him in astonishment because we had such different cancers, and his was such a long time ago, and yet we had such similar experiences. And that's when I knew that I needed to understand this better, and I needed to ask the questions that I was always asking. And I ended up interviewing over 100 cancer patients and caregivers and experts of all types. And what I learned is that, in fact, cancer is emotional. It's emotional for 99.99% of us who are diagnosed with cancer. And the best that we can do to support others going through cancer is to understand that cancer is emotional. Now, we've all heard of the grueling treatments that most of us have to go through. Radical surgeries, poison potions, radiation. These are really blunt instruments that, in the process of eradicating cancer, actually do a lot of damage to our bodies as well. For some lucky few, and more this is the case, those blunt instruments are being replaced by targeted therapies and immunotherapies. And those are a little bit easier, but for most of us, the process of dealing with cancer is very arduous. But regardless of the type of treatment, and often because of the treatment itself, there's a physiological impact that makes it far more challenging for those of us who have other health crises to compare it to. One patient I interviewed, Mark, had open heart surgery 5 years earlier, a quintuple bypass, and he said, there was nothing compared to cancer. Another woman who had a brain aneurysm that could have killed her found that that was not nearly as challenging as her stage 1 uterine cancer was. So people have a very visceral and challenging response to a cancer diagnosis. And there are a number of reasons for that, some of which are external and some of which are related to our bodies themselves. The first thing that we have to keep in mind is that for millennia, cancer has been a death sentence. And so when you hear the words, "you've got cancer," it is logical for us to assume, yep, I'm going to die from it. And of course, that's no longer the case for many of us. We're fortunate to be living in the time that we're living now, and cancer has many more treatments available to it, many improvements in diagnoses, and it's not a death sentence, but we still think it is. Add to that the fact that there's a sense of personal responsibility when we hear the words, "you've got cancer." Like, I didn't do enough to prevent my cancer. I smoked longer than I should have, even when I knew it was bad, or I enjoyed my chocolate dessert too often, or we think that we're responsible, but in fact, cancer happens, and it is nobody's fault that they get cancer. It's just the luck of the draw. But because of that sense of responsibility, that also happens to heighten our emotional response. And as much as we'd like to think in this room in particular that there is no longer a stigma about having cancer, in fact, there is a societal stigma around cancer. And in some cultures in particular, if you've had cancer, you're considered damaged goods. There are a lot of women who won't even tell their husbands that they have gynecologic cancer because of the concern for what their husband will think of them now that they have that cancer. So that stigma also heightens the intensity of the emotions around cancer. Add to that the fact that it's not your regular doctor who's going to be treating you with cancer, but this is a brand new doctor that you don't know and you don't necessarily have the rapport with to be able to talk about what it is you're going through with that doctor. And that doctor most likely has a very specialized focus. And we love the fact that we can see a specialist for things, but sometimes we want to be treated as a whole human being, not just a body that has a cancerous tumor. And so those things are all going on in the background. At the same time, we're dealing with the complexity of, well, what exactly is my diagnosis? What does this cancer mean for me and my treatment? And sometimes we don't know, and it can take months before we figure that out. For me, it was a 10-day wait for surgery and then a 10-day wait for the lab reports to come back to say what the cancer was and what my next steps were. For some people, that can be a months-long process of waiting and finding out, and then, nope, we still don't know what it is. And so there's this period of uncertainty that also heightens the emotions. And then, of course, you're never entirely sure that it's going to work. You know, a surgeon friend of mine says, well, you know, open heart surgery, that's like plumbing. You know, we know how to do that, and it's going to happen. Well, cancer is more like an art, and we hope that this treatment is going to work, but every one of our bodies is different, and our chemical makeups is different, and so maybe it's going to work, and maybe it's not. And that uncertainty contributes to the challenges that we face at the emotional level. Those are the things that are going on the outside. But what's happening inside your body? It turns out that there are a lot of physiological changes, so changes at the cellular level as a result of the disease and a number of the treatments. First of all, there's the stress and fatigue that happens as a result of the disease, and certainly as a result of the treatment. And, you know, as we all know, like when you're racing for an appointment and you're 10 minutes late to an event that's important to you, you get a little stressed, and then you lose your temper, and your emotions get a little out of control. Well, so if you are a cancer patient, you're dealing with that stress and that fatigue for months on end that are sort of fraying your emotions. Also, during cancer, there can be radical hormonal changes. Now, obviously with gynecologic cancer, they took out a lot of my hormone-producing organs. That changed the way I viewed the world. But even if it's not a gynecologic cancer or prostate cancer, there are changes to our hormonal systems as a result of the presence of cancer, and often we're taking hormonal suppressant chemotherapy. So the chemotherapy is going to suppress our hormone response, or they give us dexamethasone, which, you know, is a wonderful drug, gives you all sorts of energy, helps you get through your cancer treatment. Oh yeah, but it also messes with your hormones. It is a steroid, it is a hormone. So these changes influence how we experience cancer throughout. But there's one last thing that I didn't know about until I actually spoke with a neuroscientist, and that's something called pro-inflammatory cytokines. Now, we might have heard about cytokines recently because there were cytokine storms related to COVID, but essentially, without going into a full biology lesson, cytokines are a protein in our body that allows the immune system to communicate with itself. And there are pro-inflammatory cytokines and anti-inflammatory cytokines. And when we're healthy, they're in balance. But when you get a paper cut, the pro-inflammatory cytokines come to the site of that paper cut and say, oh my goodness, we have an exposure to infection. Let's bring some white blood cells here. Let's bring some platelets to close up that infection. Let's get some extra red blood cells here so we can feed the growth of new healthy tissue to cover up that. And then when the paper cut is healed, the anti-inflammatory cytokines get busy and remove those excess cells from the site, and things get back in balance. Well, if a paper cut causes an increase in pro-inflammatory cytokines, just imagine what radical surgery can do to your body. So we get a massive influx in pro-inflammatory cytokines at the time of surgery. But it turns out that actually the presence of a tumor is causing inflammation and pro-inflammatory cytokines. And chemotherapy causes the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And radiation therapy. And, oh, by the way, many immunotherapies are actually a type of cytokine. So our bodies become awash with pro-inflammatory cytokines. The bad news is that when the brain reads that, oh my God, there's so much pro-inflammatory cytokine activity going on, what the brain hears is, we are really sick. Let's go back to bed, pull the covers up, and not come out for weeks on end. And that, of course, contributes to the fatigue, the depression, the sense of isolation, the chemo brain that so many people talk about. It's a major source of imbalance in our brains, and it's something that takes a long time to get restored to normal. As a result of all of those chemical changes, we can anticipate that in addition to the fear and anxiety that are so common at the time of hearing the words, you've got cancer, you can anticipate that somebody will be depressed at some point in their cancer experience. They will have some sort of cognitive impairment, whether they have chemo or just from the inflammation itself. They will feel isolated. They will feel a loss of control over their lives. They will have self-identity issues, anger, general loss and sadness, often frustration and guilt and helplessness. Now, it turns out that it's pretty predictable both that these emotions will happen and when in the process they will happen. But how we internalize and express our emotions varies enormously. So, I was somebody who never cried in public, and so of course I kept my emotions, pretty close to myself. Others bear their emotions on their sleeves, and some people have built such defenses against emotional volatility that they're not even sure they are experiencing those emotions. So we're all different, but there's a very good chance that those emotions are going on in the background. And often, particularly in October, with all of the breast cancer Pinktober activity, we're told to be strong, we're told to be brave, and so we often suppress our true emotions. And when we suppress our true emotions, not surprisingly, our relationships can take a hit. As patients, we hold back our fears, not wanting to overburden those around us, or not feeling that we are deserving of more support, or trying to live up to our independent self-images, or not being sure that we're going to get the kind of support back from those around us that we would want. And so we keep our thoughts to ourselves. I was lucky. I have a large support team. I have an adoring husband and family. But my husband, despite his abiding belief in my strengths, which of course helped me to stay strong, he's uncomfortable talking about any sort of health issues. So he didn't want to hear my deepest, darkest fears. And oh, by the way, he was afraid of my mortality as much as I was. And so I couldn't let it all out with him because that would burden him too much. Same with my daughter. My daughter was home for the year. She had just graduated from college. She hadn't intended to take care of her mother through her cancer experience. She was busy applying to law school. How could I burden her with my nightmares? And my best friend, the one who would have known exactly what to say and how to comfort me, she had passed away from cancer just 6 months before my diagnosis. So that left some huge gaps in who I could rely on and how I could share my cancer story. And of course, those gaps meant that I allowed some distance to grow in some very important relationships. And it's not uncommon as a friend or a family member to a cancer patient to not know how to help. And so my husband, despite his fear of medicine, would be very warm and supportive and want to help, but not quite know what to say. And often, it's because we don't know what's going on with the cancer patient and because we're even afraid of what we might hear if we ask the patient what's really going on, that we are uncomfortable engaging in those conversations. If you can't do anything to fix it, it can be really hard to hear it on the emotional level. So as caregivers, we carry our own fears and burdens as well, as I mentioned, my husband struggling. But we also have to worry about how to keep the household running while the one who might have been running the household is out of commission due to cancer. So there's a lot of complex things going on in a household. And sometimes, as a supportive friend, we want to make ourselves feel good by feeling like we have that the patient feels good, or that we have the solution to make the patient feel good. So in the absence of true understanding, we might fall back on platitudes. Everything's going to be all right, or you're so brave, or if anyone can get through it, you can. Or worse, as one patient told me, a friend said to him, well, we all got to go sometime. Oh, ouch. Just ouch, you know. So what do you say to a loved one or friend who has cancer, and how do you support and help someone going through it? I think it starts by recognizing that it's perfectly normal to have an emotional response to cancer, that it's part of the disease, and to assume as a loving caregiver that the patient you love is feeling more than he or she is sharing with you, that they might not even be aware of the full depth of their emotion, but they are certainly not going to tell you everything that they're feeling unless they feel 100% trust and confidence in you as a supporter. I also suggest that friends and loving caregivers spend more time listening than talking. So many patients have reported being offended by a comment that was well-intentioned, but either offers medical advice or mentions another person's disease or another person's miracle cure, another person's death, and unless specifically asked for, there's a very good chance that this medical advice or comparison is not going to be well received. It's important to remember that it's not about where it's coming from, but really how it lands. And that's just so important. I mean, we do have our good intentions mostly in place, but sometimes our best intentions don't land quite the way we would like them to. So as one patient, Elise, told me, you really just want someone who's going to hold your hand and make space for you to say what it is you need to say. And it is possible to turn some of those platitudes, some of those statements that we so easily turn to into a supportive rather than a hurtful comment. So if you find yourself wanting to say you're so brave, you might consider that many patients don't actually think it's brave to do what they need to do. They have to go through chemo. They have no choice. So instead, you might say something like, it must be so hard to do what you need to do. I'm here for you. That communicates an understanding of, yes, this looks like a brave act to me, but also an understanding of, you have to do it. If you're tempted to say, hang in there, or keep a stiff upper lip, you might find your support is better received if, in fact, you reflect that it's not being negative to own a negative emotion, to own an emotion that society looks poorly on. And so instead you could say, it's okay to feel bad. We all feel like crying sometimes, and you have more reason than most. Again, understanding that there's likely a desire on the part of the patient to really let it out sometimes. Many patients and their families feel overwhelmed by the need to keep life going while coping with cancer. And a good friend will look for opportunities to sort of step in and support the home. Maybe you offer to mow the lawn or make dinner or drive the kids to school. Whatever needs to be done but doesn't need to be done by the patient is something that a good friend and supporter can do. But before you jump in, please ask, may I do this for you? One of the things that patients struggle with is the loss of control over their lives during the cancer experience. And having a decision taken away from you can make you feel even smaller in your life. As one patient, Nancy, recounted to me, she had just woken up in the hospital. She was a busy public relations executive. She was obviously, still dealing with the anesthesia and coming to grips with the reality of her new life. her cell phone rang, and her daughter very quickly flipped it on to silent and didn't even allow her to answer the call or say whether she wanted to answer the call. And she was livid because although her daughter was well-intentioned, here was another piece of control, another chance to feel some agency in her life being taken away from her. Another patient, Angela, spoke often about sort of losing her sense of position within her own household, that she used to be the one who everyone came to for advice and counsel and help in making decisions. And now, all of a sudden, people were making decisions without her and not even bothering to tell her about that. And that contributed to her sense of not feeling good about herself during cancer. Sometimes we make statements that are inadvertently imply criticism, like, oh, but you're the one who always eats right and exercises, as if that would make a difference, you know? Our bodies are constantly producing mutant cells, and every once in a while one slips through, and it's not because I ate that chocolate dessert, which was so good, but because my body was producing more cancer cells, more errant cells than it should have been. The last area where a number of us get into trouble is by making statements such as, well, God has his reasons, or God never gives us more than we can handle. And those statements are particularly hard for patients to hear because then you have to ask yourself, well, but what did I do to deserve this? Why is God giving me this challenge? So most patients say that the most helpful thing you can do is to make your presence felt with love, to just show up, to sit with the patient and offer hugs, hold his hand, be a shoulder to cry on, and to be fluid, because what's needed one day may be very different from what's needed the next day. Ask the patient, how are you doing? What can I do for you? And really mean it. Really mean it. That's the important thing. You might be the only person that the cancer patient has to be real with. He may not have. He may have to be strong for everyone else, and you may be the one where he can let his hair down with. And so many patients say it's so important to continue to show up. Often, patients feel like they are dismissed by their medical team when treatment ends, and dropped by their friends when their treatment ends, because everybody assumes, okay, cancer's over, let's go back to normal. Well, cancer's not over. The anxiety stays with us a long time. The uncertainty as to whether or not the treatment has worked, whether or not the cancer is going to come back, that stays with us a long time. And so it's important to just keep on showing up. So as Tanya mentioned in the opening, we do all have reserves of strength and resilience, but it's hard for us to remember our own strengths. And as supporters, one of the best things you can do for patients you love with cancer is to help us remember those hidden reserves. Listening with an open heart can go a really long way to helping patients. All you really need to say is, you talk, I'll listen.